Why is GST so high on food in New Zealand? What are the pros and cons of high GST? I made a detailed video previously explaining why food is so expensive in New Zealand, and one of the reasons I mentioned is our high GST on food. Here's a table showing OECD nations and their GDP per capita compared to their GST on food. Note that GST is called VAT in Europe. GDP per capita is calculated by dividing the total GDP of the country by its total population. Ordered by GDP per capita, at the very top of the table you'll see Luxembourg, Switzerland and Ireland, all of which have set very low rates of GST on food. Then there is Norway with a GST rate of 15% on food, just like New Zealand's. But note how their GDP per capita is almost double ours. If you look at nations with a similar GDP per capita to us, such as South Korea, Israel, Italy and Spain, you'll notice that they all have low or 0% GST on food. So why would New Zealand charge the same GST on food as nations much wealthier than us, instead of having low GST on food like nations with a similar GDP per capita to ours? There are pros and cons of implementing high GST on food, and each of these has an impact on New Zealand's economy, businesses and its consumers. I'll explain the pros and cons and then discuss the reasons why New Zealand has opted for high GST. Let's start with the downsides of high GST. I've already mentioned how New Zealand has a large number of kids who do not have enough food to eat and don't have a bed to sleep in. In a food-producing country like New Zealand, it is a surprise to many foreigners how so many New Zealand families can't afford to buy food and how many seek support from food banks and charities. Child poverty is a significant issue in New Zealand. High GST on food has a regressive impact on low-income individuals and families. A progressive tax imposes a lower tax rate on low-income earners and a higher rate on those who have higher incomes, while a regressive tax system does the opposite. Tax law expert Craig Elliff argues New Zealand's tax system is not progressive. As he points out in this article, it's unlikely to change anytime soon. In March this year, a bill was put forward in Parliament proposing the removal of GST from all food products and non-alcoholic beverages. However, this was opposed by ACT New Zealand First National and Labour. If you're not from New Zealand, our two major parties are the centre-left Labour Party and the centre-right National Party, and both of these are against removing GST from essential food items such as bread and milk. A high GST can disproportionately affect low-income families as they have to spend a larger portion of their income on taxable goods and services. For example, say a family earns $1,000 a week, but their rent, food and power bill comes to $1,000, then they'll never get ahead in life. Compare this to a family earning $5,000 a week who also spends $1,000 on these bills, but they'll have money left over, whereas the first family does not. New Zealand's high GST on food and electricity means low-income families are left both hungry and cold. Poor nutrition and damp, cold living environments lead to health conditions such as pneumonia, and this negatively impacts New Zealand's healthcare system. So a higher GST on food and electricity leads to poverty, as the regressive nature of GST can exacerbate income inequality. This is because high GST takes a larger percentage of income from those who are less able to afford it. Middle-income families struggle with New Zealand's high cost of food also. High GST on food contributes to New Zealand's brain drain as young families leave New Zealand and they move to nations with more favourable taxation systems. As young people leave New Zealand to raise their families in other countries such as Australia, this leaves New Zealand with an ageing population and fewer taxpayers to pay income tax. Moving on to inflation. Inflation is a concern when GST is high. An increase in GST leads to higher prices for goods and services, which adds to inflationary pressures. So inflation is an issue when GST is high on food and electricity. Another major downside of high GST is its impact on consumer spending. Higher GST rates can lead to decreased consumer spending, which can negatively impact businesses and overall economic growth. When New Zealand's GST rate increased to 15% in 2010, consumers thought twice about going out to dinner or eating out at cafes as the cost was noticeably higher. When families choose to stay at home to save money, the cafes and restaurants miss out on revenue. Tourism makes up a significant proportion of our GDP, and yet tourists are put off going out for dinner because of the high cost of food here. Some even say they wouldn't come back to New Zealand again for a holiday. Australians make up around half of our tourists here in the South Island, and when I talk to Australians about their holiday, They say that they love the hiking and the skiing, and they'll even tolerate the New Zealanders, but the high cost of food ruins their family holiday and they just can't enjoy meals out every night. On the upside for them, visiting New Zealand makes them complain less about the high cost of food in Australia, so when they go home they realise how much worse things are in New Zealand than their own country. High GST can add to business costs by creating an additional administrative burden. Having no GST on food reduces the administrative burdens for businesses, but having a high 15% on food means cafes and restaurants struggle with the additional counting and admin costs, and this disproportionately affects small and medium-sized businesses. As I said in my previous video, small food-producing businesses such as egg farms and vegetable producers often close their businesses due to New Zealand's high compliance costs. The extra administrative burden of high GST is just one more nail in the coffin. So moving on, high GST creates a competitive disadvantage. Higher GST rates can make domestic goods more expensive compared to those from countries with lower consumption taxes, which affects international competitiveness. This is a major competitive disadvantage for New Zealand. High GST rates encourage tax evasion and the growth of an underground economy known as a black market, as both consumers and businesses want to avoid paying higher taxes. So high GST on food can lead to tax evasion. New immigrants in New Zealand sometimes grow food or produce food products and sell these at the local markets, and they avoid compliance costs and don't pay the GST or income on this produce. In the US, it's apparently quite common for IRS employees to randomly visit farmers markets to ensure everyone is complying and paying their taxes, but I've never seen this happen in New Zealand, which means businesses that pay their taxes and compliance costs are disadvantaged compared to those who don't. High GST on fruit and vegetables means families can't afford healthy food and often opt for cheaper junk food options. New Zealand has an obesity epidemic, and supporters of removing GST on fruit and veggies argue that this will make healthy food more accessible for struggling families. However, opponents argue obese families wouldn't buy vegetables and fruit anyway, even if they were cheaper. I grew up in a poor suburb myself, and I observed this as the poorest families do tend to buy pizza and bottles of Coke, while the middle-income families cooked meat and vegetable meals at home. Opponents of reducing GST on food believe the government should spend more on nutritional information and education rather than reducing GST. There are also sector-specific challenges with GST. New Zealand applies high GST uniformly to essential food items and essential healthcare. Joe Mackenzie McLean, who has bowel cancer, has spoken out about the shock of having to pay $21,000 in GST on top of the cancer treatment she had to pay for. Adding 15% on top of expensive cancer treatment can bankrupt a family, so high GST can have many negative social impacts. So now let's discuss the pros of high GST. Ranjana Gupta is a senior lecturer in taxation at the Auckland University of Technology. Gupta opposes reducing GST on food and says, "My research found that the costs of tampering with New Zealand's current GST system far outweigh the benefits likely to accrue from such a change." Eric Crampton, an economist at the New Zealand Initiative, also says taking GST off food would be a mistake. He argues that removing GST off food would come at a substantial cost, as it would make it harder for the government to raise revenue for the things that voters want while imposing high administrative costs. So let's take a look at these reasons why the government imposes high GST on food in New Zealand. To start with, we'll look at the simplicity in tax collection. Applying a high 15% GST uniformly is supposed to be simpler for businesses. GST is collected at the point of sale, which simplifies the tax collection process, as the seller doesn't have to figure out which items are GST-free and which aren't. For example, if fresh tomatoes and apples are GST-free and a can of Coke isn't, the seller doesn't need to be aware of this. The New Zealand government argues that applying 15% GST uniformly to both healthy and unhealthy food makes the process much simpler. I used to work at Inland Revenue when I was a young graduate, and one of the arguments they put forward is that New Zealand has one of the simplest taxation systems in the world. The belief is that having different rates of GST on food and luxury items would complicate the tax system. However, other nations are managing this situation without issues, and the argument that an unfair taxation system is better because it's simpler is a weak justification for high GST on food. Economists in New Zealand and the New Zealand government has argued that removing GST from food would be a very expensive and complex exercise in terms of administration, although my observation is that the government was happy to increase GST on food and other goods and services back in 2010, so they were clearly fine with the administration costs of amending GST upwards, but they're not okay with the cost of administration and the complexity of implementation amending GST downwards. Eric Crampton states that the UK had 13 years of litigation over whether a tea cake was taxable, and Australia had similar issues with ciabatta bread. So these are examples of the expense and complexity of tax administration that he's given in this article here. However, I would like to point out that a fundamental element of democracy is debating various perspectives. Voting for representatives who argue your point in Parliament is a democratic right. If politicians don't argue over tea cakes and bread, they'd argue over other issues because that is the basis of democracy. If our politicians didn't argue in pointless circles and achieve little, then we just wouldn't have a democracy. An advantage of high GST on food is increased government revenue. As higher GST rates can generate more revenue for the government can use the money to fund public services. These public services could be healthcare, education, infrastructure such as roads and so forth. High GST broadens the tax base. GST is applied to everyday goods and services such as food items, and this spreads the tax burden more evenly across the economy. Consumption taxes like GST are generally more stable sources of revenue compared to income taxes, which can fluctuate with economic conditions. For example, during a recession, if many people lose their jobs, the government would lose income tax. But people still have to eat during a recession, so people would still buy food. Therefore, adding high GST on food means the government can collect stable revenue. Another advantage of high GST on food is it can help reduce the deficit. Increased revenue from high GST can help to reduce budget deficits and national debt. Tax on consumption is also supposed to encourage savings and investments instead of spending. By taxing food consumption rather than income, high GST can encourage people to save more, which may lead to greater capital formation and economic growth. Although in the case of high GST on food, people don't really have much of an option to save money instead of buying food, so I personally don't think this is much of a benefit. One of the reasons I believe we have such high GST on food is because we're a tourist destination. Tourists arrive in New Zealand and look around at our scenery, then eat out at cafes and stay in hotels, so the government wants to ensure the food in hotels are taxed heavily. When I travelled around Europe, I spent a lot of money on museum and art gallery fees, but here in New Zealand, you can walk around looking at scenery and the government can't really charge an entry fee on that. In Europe, it's common to charge an entry fee to visit public parks and to use the toilets, but we don't have that here. So the government must charge high GST on food, otherwise having tourists in our country would be a burden with few financial rewards. Opponents of high GST on food say we should remove the GST on food but leave the 15% GST on hotels and the tourist activities, or even increase GST on hotels and tourist activities. But again, this comes back to the government's argue that this is just too complex and costly to do. So now let's move on to social welfare costs. In the budget 2022 to 23, the biggest slice of the pie went to social welfare. Social welfare spending is greater than health and education. When a nation has a large number of people who are not working or paying income tax, applying GST on food is one of the only ways for the government to generate revenue from welfare beneficiaries. In Western nations, there's considerable debate about how to manage our ageing populations and our welfare recipients, but that's a whole other video in itself. Aside from our elderly and welfare beneficiaries who are not paying income tax, we also have a lot of tourists who arrive on a 12-month working visa who barely work at all during that time. I've met dozens of people travelling around New Zealand, and many have told me they work in Australia for the higher wages and then they'll just come over to New Zealand and relax and go hiking or mountain climbing for the year. So these people are using our roads and public services and they're parking their vans for the night in our freedom camps, but they're not actually paying income tax a lot of the time, which means that we must impose high GST on food, as it's the only way to recoup the cost of these people. There is a lot of debate in New Zealand about these low-quality tourists, as people call them. because they cost our nation more than what they're actually contributing. Another type of tourist I see a lot these days are the ones who have online jobs, so they're paying income tax in the US or Europe or wherever their home country is, but they're living here and consuming our services. So this is another major concern for New Zealand, as these people apply for a 12-month working visa, but they don't actually work here or pay income tax, as they already have an online job in their home country and pay taxes there. So in conclusion, until New Zealand can reduce the number of people living in this country who don't pay income tax, the government really has no choice but to maintain high GST on food and electricity and healthcare. Please let me know in the comments if you have anything further that you wanted to add to this. Thanks for watching. Bye.